Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unsettled. I'm your host, Martin Nyanzu, and I have with me a friend, a theologian, someone I've come to know and cherish on this podcast, and I'm excited about what we're going to talk about. I have here with me Dr. Allison Norton. She is the Faculty Associate in Migration Studies and Congregational Life at Hartford International University, where she directs the Pastoral Innovation Network of New England. She also teaches courses in sociology of religion, immigration, and multicultural and intergenerational ministry. Her research and publication explores the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on U.S. congregations, the rise of megachurches in West Africa, the role of migration on the worldwide expansion of Christian faith, and the religious identities of the new second generation. Dr. Norton, welcome to Unsettled.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you so much for making time to be with us. On this episode, I want us to talk about religion. Is everybody religious? There's a lot of confusion on the topic, and I know that's your area. So I wanted you to help my audience understand what religion is, because there are so many, religions today, and I'm not sure that if all of them will fit, there is a one-size-fit-all definition for all of them. So let's begin from there.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And as you mentioned, just looking at the diversity of religious expressions, experiences, practices globally around the world, it is very difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all definition. And I'll say that when I think about this question, what is religion? I recognize that the answer to that actually differs depending on where you're coming from and your view of the world and your standpoint. So I tend to think about this bringing in insights from the sociology of religion in particular, because when we think about religion sociologically, we see religion as one of the most powerful, deeply felt, and influential forces across human history. We see that religion plays a very significant aspect in our social lives. It has a very important social dimension. So it's not just important to us as individuals, right? But has an important role to play in society, in culture, in political spheres. And so this sociological perspective is a way of looking at religion that actually focuses on the human and the social aspects of belief and practice. So it's not just something that people believe, but it's something that people actually do, right? Looking at this action side. And so I think that if we look at definitions and some of the standard definitions, there's sort of two major streams of thought here. So on the one side, sociologists of religion have tended to view religion as something substantive. So they've come up with definitions that define the substance, the character, the content of what a religion is. So this approach, the substantive approach, looks at particularly the content of belief and practice. What do people believe? What do they practice? And here the emphasis is on formal beliefs and this very brainy sort of cognitive view of religion. And these definitions tend to include belief in God or belief in a supernatural power as core to what constitutes something that is religious. But there are other streams of thought. One is functional, and this view asks the question, what does religion do for the individual and for the society? So this is often concerned with the ultimate problems of meaning and how religion gives us as humans meaning in our life. So in this sense, it's inherently a human process in the search for meaning, for our lives, for our purpose, for our sense of being in the world. And so the content of what you believe, the particular theology, the particular belief, the particular practice is less important in functional views. And it's more about what do we as individuals and society consider sacred. And then a third approach that I happen to really like has to do with the idea of religion as lived. Religion that happens in everyday life, not just something that's confined to a church building or structure. But what do people actually do in their everyday lives that they consider spiritual or religious? This can be at home, it can be at work, it can be in their neighborhoods. And so this changes the definition of religion a little bit, thinking about religion as how we live it out, right? It's not just about our beliefs and our practices, but how we act on what we believe, right? How we live out what we believe in the world and society. And so we as humans, what we consider as having a spiritual dimension, our religious realities, is not just confined to the life of the church or any particular religious institution or organization, but happens in ordinary places and is in the lives of ordinary people. So I think going back to your question, what is religion? I think for me, it's important for us when we think to answer this to recognize that religion happens in social groups and settings, right? That what is religion is never just about
Mm.
religion. That it involves belief, practices, and also our social groups. That there's a sense of overlap between what happens in our religious spheres and with the rest of our lives.
So, with these nuances, what do you have to say to someone who says, I'm not religious. Forget about religion. Um,
Yeah.
what can you say to such a person?
Well, this is, I think, where it's really important to look at what's happening in US society and in parts of Europe with the rise of secularization. So, this is kind of a hot buzzword, right? We talk about secularization, secularism. What does this mean? How does this relate to a spiritual view that a person might have with a larger sort of secular view of the world and society? And if you step back and look just at the U.S. context, one of the most striking changes that we see in the religious landscape is the growth of people who, like you're saying, say I am not religious, right? We sociologists call them the religious nuns, Nones, right? The people who, if they're taking a survey and it wants you to mark, are you Christian? Are you Muslim? They mark none of the above, right? I am not any of these religious traditions. I do not identify with a particular religious tradition. So I think this is a very timely and important question, right? What does it mean for someone to not identify with a particular religious tradition? And if you look in U.S. society, a full 35%, so more than 1 in 3 of American adults under the age 30 fall into this category. They are religiously unaffiliated. Okay, so if you're going to go out and have a conversation with someone under the age of 30, the odds are that at least 1 out of 3 of them will, right, identify themselves this way. I am not a religious person. Some scholars call the religious nuns the overachievers in the U.S. religious landscape because they've outpaced all our projections of how many folks they would be. They're kind of growing much more rapidly than any sociologist of religion predicted. Um, and I think there are a couple things to think about in this rise of the religious nuns or the nunning of American religion and spirituality. The first is that the boundaries between those that are affiliated, that claim a Christian or other faith identity, and the unaffiliated, these boundaries are
Mm.
porous. Okay, so if you look at those who today are the religious nuns, 70% of them were raised in families affiliated with institutionalized
Mm.
religion. Many of them, most of them, were raised in Christian Protestant households. So, this background, the way that they were raised as children, influenced and shapes features of their spiritual life across their lifespan. Okay. So there's some very porous boundaries, right? That often they were raised in a Christian Protestant home. And as they have gone into early and emerging adulthood, have stepped out of that, right? Affiliation with a particular religious tradition. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And some of them are very good reasons. They've pointed in part to the hypocrisy that they've seen within their Christian communities of worship. They've pointed out the ways they've seen abuse of power by religious leaders. They've pointed to aspects of Christianity and the alignment with politics, right, that they have not resonated with. And so there are reasons that they have, but I think the important thing for us to see is that this is not necessarily a turn away from the spiritual or the religious, but actually the emergence of sometimes overlapping multiple ideas around religious and spiritual experience, that is in a lot of ways a reaction to what they've seen as harm that has been caused by Christian churches and Christian communities. So it's not necessarily a turn away from religion, right? And this is where it's helpful to think about those who would claim or identify with this idea of being spiritual but not religious. So they still affirm the role of the spiritual in their lives and the meaning that it has for them, but they're not necessarily following those traditional modes of church attendance, church belonging. And so we see these implications in our churches, in our congregations. One of the large studies that I've been working on is a partnership called Faith Communities Today Project. And we've been studying the trends in congregational life for almost 25 years in the United States. And so it is very clear that there has been worsening attendance at congregations over time. If you looked at 2000, at that time, the average congregation in the United States had about 137 people in attendance. You fast forward to 2020, and we see that that number has gone down to 65,
Mm.
65 people in attendance. So it's cut in more than half. So it's very true that we see a decline in church attendance over several decades. And along that, the rise of the religious nuns. But I think the most important point I want to make is just to not assume that all of them are atheists, because actually a very small percentage of them are atheists, less than 10%. They are more likely than not to still consider aspects of spirituality important in their personal lives.
That's I like the way you put it, because there's been this worry, or I mean, we should be worried, but maybe it's overly done that when people leave the church or when church attendance dips, then religion is dying. I mean, people are forgetting about God, and I mean, you can leave a particular church or denomination and go to another. But here, the concern is people leaving all churches, and we make to believe that they're not going anywhere. I mean, they're done with God. But that's my question. Can we be done with God or something spiritual? Is there any human being in this world who can say that for me, I have nothing to do with spirituality? I'm done. Is it possible? Can we reach this state of being?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say it is possible, right? People do claim, right, an atheist identity and strongly adhere to a form of sort of secular humanism in their personal lives. But I do think that there are, like you said, these fears, right? These fears that if we don't see the numbers that we saw 10 years ago in church, that that we need to start panicking. And I would say that's the wrong response. um, that instead of panicking, I think we have to ask really important questions, and especially those of us within churches and who are leaders of churches, whether that's a pastor or you're a lay leader in your church, instead of approaching this from a sense of fear or a sense of hopelessness, to rather say, let's listen carefully. to those young adults in our families, in our communities who have chosen to leave the church. And let's find out why, right? Let's find out why they have chosen to leave, and let's find out where they're finding in their everyday lives. This goes back to religion as a lived everyday experience. How in their everyday lives are they connecting with God, or are they connecting with a spiritual place in their everyday lives? And I think we have a lot to learn from how the ways in which religion exists outside of churches. And I think for many of us, and I think particularly for myself, being raised up in and rooted in a Pentecostal tradition of faith, if there's any group of Christians who should be able to see the role of the Spirit in the world beyond the church, it is us. And so I think that's where we need to pause and ask, where is the Spirit working in the lives of young people? And where might we not recognize that because we are perhaps blinded by seeing religion as something that exists exclusively within inside of the church walls?
So those who've left the church, but are maintaining some form of spirituality, are they religious in whatever circles they find themselves or whatever they're doing?
That goes back to how you
That's
define
right.
religion, right? And this is a bit contested because oftentimes, as you started out with, there's a sort of, oh, I'm not religious, right? Because there's this idea that associates religion with power, perhaps with dominance, with maybe oppression in the world. And so there's a real hesitancy to align with institutionalized religion because of what it signifies, right? And this is where there's all this baggage, right, that goes along with the idea of religion. So for many, that word religion is like, it's like a nasty word, right? It's like a bad word that why would you want to claim that sort of identity for yourself? And so this is where I think, again, it's an opportunity to listen and to learn from those who have perhaps been experienced religious trauma in their lives, or have otherwise felt rejected by the church or specific religious communities, to kind of step back and say, what can we learn from those experiences in that dynamic?
You spoke about being religious in content, right? Everybody believes something, I'm assuming, or I hope. Now, whatever we believe or anybody believes eventually will affect our conduct. So for those who don't go to church,
Yeah.
but yet have some belief content, what does that make them?
Hmm.
And why do they have those content in the first place?
This is really an emerging area of study and insight. So there are some newer works coming out to specifically look at this question, right? What is the content of belief and experience? And I think one of the big takeaways, and we see this in the work of Elizabeth Dreschler, is that for those who specifically identify as spiritual but not religious, that their spiritual beliefs are less about specific beliefs, right, or sort of a specific theology, and much more about a way of being in the world. So traditionally, we often think of religion as having a particular theological content, right? A particular text, religious text like the Bible. Um, Oftentimes, for folks that are spiritual, but not religious, again, they see the role of spirituality much more about their way of being in the world, and much less about a particular belief. Now, again, we have to recognize that 75% of them
Yeah.
came from and were born into or raised up in these more traditional religious spaces like Protestant Christianity. And so this is where we do have to see those boundaries, right, as very porous, because we all know that what we grow up with and the ways in which we're raised also tend to influence us throughout our life.
Hmm. Now, what are the benefits of religion to the person, society? Why would a person want to be religious, even though that term many people frown upon?
Yeah, well, if you think about religion as a sense of belonging to a certain group, I think we can all look throughout history and even now and see the benefit of religious communities and congregations. I was just at a church over the summer, one of the churches that's participating in our study of the impact of the pandemic on congregation. So we're doing this large study, 5-year study, trying to understand how the pandemic has impacted churches across the nation. And one church that I was in doing research, an elder got up and spoke and talked about loneliness as a pandemic within the pandemic, right? That we've all known the health risks associated with COVID-19, but something that's also emerged over the last 3 years is just a growing sense of loneliness, a sense of isolation from community by many people across our country. And so I think being part of a community, right, belonging with a Christian tradition or other religious tradition, it does give you an opportunity, a sort of antidote to loneliness. Okay, so this might sound very mundane, very non-spiritual, right? But I think it's a real reality that congregations are places of belonging, are places um, of friendship, of relationship, that is actually, I think, built into what we see in the life of Jesus, who surrounded himself with a core group of disciples, right? That he didn't do it alone, but he walked alongside others who he came to love. Um, I also think that one of the negative reactions against the church and against religion is the ways in which religion has caused harm in the world. And I think we have to acknowledge and repent for the ways in which religion has been used to oppress, in alignment with violence in places in the world, historically and contemporarily. But we also see so much good, and I look no further than the rise of the civil rights movement
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, right? Where if Black churches did not exist, I do not think that the civil rights movement would have been successful. But it was within Black churches where they provided organizational centers, right? Where African American people could plan, could organize, could work for nonviolent change to bring justice. And that's a very powerful story and example of the good that religion can do in the world, the ways in which it can bring about justice, equity, belonging, love in our world and society. So beyond thinking about just the theological reasons, there are indeed um, powerful stories of religion as a force for good and a force that really is rooted in the case of Christianity in the love of Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to touch on the civil rights movement, the abolition of slavery, and all of that. But there's a point you made about using religion to oppress or harm in the
Yes.
past. Now,
Yes.
logically, some have said that, well, religion has oppressed, done bad, and so I don't want to be religious, I don't want to go to church. But if you look at historical
Right.
trends, the last, I mean, regardless of the harm that religion has done, historically, you realize that the last 19th century has done more harm than what religion has done. Looking at the atomic bomb, the nuclear energy, the wars all over the world, put all of that combined, it's done more harm than religion. So I would think that
Mhm.
if these things have done more harm than religion, then if you put them on a scale, you rather take religion versus not being religious. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, let's talk about this, right? Let's talk about this. Um, I think where Christians in particular go wrong in this is when we ignore the times that religion
Hmm.
has caused harm. And so I do think that there is a place for repentance by the church. And so, you look, for example, you could talk about history, but you can also talk about now. Many spaces we see religious leaders abuse their spiritual power, right? So you see the sexual abuse that
Hmm.
happens by religious leaders in many communities, in Catholic communities, in Pentecostal, evangelical, right? Anytime there's alignment with religion and power, it has the potential to lead to abuse. And so I think we need to repent. We need to not ignore that reality. We need to ensure that we do not perpetuate and continue these places of harm and oppression. So I think recognizing that is very important. But at the same side, like you're saying, we can't ignore the good, right? We can't also ignore the ways in which people, have opportunities to bring about positive change in the world through their religious organizations, and how many people seek to bring about good in the world from a deeply held religious place of conviction. So I think about in the United States, if you look at refugee resettlement in the
Hmm.
United States, the US government officially partners with 9 nonprofits in refugee resettlement. 6 of those 9 are faith based. Okay, so 6 of those 9 organizations working to resettle refugees in collaboration with the US government are doing this out of their theological tradition and faith, right? They are seeking to make the world and the United States a place of belonging for refugees because of their faith convictions, because of their faith traditions. So I think we also have to look again at what is good and to see the many ways in which people who um, follow in the way of Jesus live that out in their lives in a very meaningful way to impact society and the world.
Now, let's talk about religious experience. Is it universal, and why? Why why can it be universal, and what is the implication of that?
Why don't you talk a little bit more about that? What are you meaning by universal?
What I mean is, in the United States, I can be spiritual or religious. When you go to other parts of the world, you find out that in some remote area, people have a sense of awareness of the divine, and they're trying to seek him.
Yes.
Why is it that all over the
Yes.
world people have this sense of awareness? And what does that
Yeah.
mean for humanity?
Well, I think it means that humans are meaning making creatures, right? We try to make sense and meaning out of our realities and our life. And oftentimes we're confronted with the edges of our understanding and reality that requires us to look beyond the ordinary, right? Because we can't understand everything fully if we look just at the ordinary lens. We often are drawn into thinking about things from a sacred perspective, right? Or something that goes beyond or transcends the ordinary that we see around us. So this is a human, often a human trait, right? To try to seek to make meaning out of our context, and to, I think, account for the problems of evil that we see in the world. How do we make sense of this? And so in some sense, yes, we do have a sort of proclivity as humans toward an embrace of a sort of sacred idea, or a supernatural view of the world. Um, at the same time, when we look at what's happened in parts of the world that have become increasingly secular in orientation, you know, it in a certain sense, if you look back in the 1950s in the United States, a much larger proportion of our population claimed a Christian identity. Um, but the question here is, what did this identity mean? And oftentimes it was just seen as synonymous with being an American. Like, to be an American, you just claimed a Christian identity, right? And so it was the default. The default is that you are a Christian. You just adopt that identity, but it doesn't necessarily have much meaning beyond just, this is a default. This is who we are. This is what we all claim as our identities. What secularism has done is just given people sort of social opportunity to opt out. Who it doesn't mean that everyone in the 1950s was a committed churchgoer. It doesn't mean that. It just means that we, as a society now, have sort of approved this, like, oh, you can opt out of this thing. You don't have to be a Christian. Not everyone has to be one. And so it gives people who maybe didn't have the opportunity before or the language before to just say, oh yeah, that's not me. So I also think that that's part of thinking about our religion from a social perspective. And so I think this is a good question. And I'd like to hear your thoughts too on sort of where you see this in terms of the relationship between our religious selves and our sort of universal sense of humanity.
Yeah, I asked the question because, like you said, we all have this innate proclivity. Who put it there? How did we get
Hmm.
it? Why is it all over the place, all over the world? What
Hmm.
does it mean to
Hmm.
us? And what are the lessons we can draw from the fact that it is common to all men or human beings to have this
Hmm.
innate proclivity
Hmm.
of seeking for
Hmm.
meaning? And we all feel this thing at the same
Yes.
time all over the world. To me, I ask because it looks
Hmm.
to me there's a sense of divine being, existence.
Hmm.
There is God. So I wonder if this feature is characteristic of every human being, then how can the atheist say there is no God? Don't they have that inner proclivity of finding meaning or seeking something that transcends them? And transcendency
Hmm.
is a requirement for being religious.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and this is where it just gets a little complicated, right? Because again, obviously someone can really have a strong sense of identity as an atheist, right? Um, but that doesn't mean they don't find meaning in their lives. That doesn't mean that there's not a search for sort of meaning and purpose. And I think this is where, and I keep pointing to this, I think when we look carefully at the lives of people um who are in that religious nun category, there's something for the church and for Christians to learn from this dynamic, because atheists have had to very clearly articulate and define why where their sense of purpose and meaning lies, because they can't default to, right, this religious sort of tradition. And so there, some have a very well developed, very articulate sense of meaning. And I think that's where I think we, those of us who are Christians, sort of need to say, what can we learn from that? How can we better articulate and live out in our lives this deep sense of meaning and purpose that we find within our religious communities and
Yeah.
traditions?
It just looks to me, though, as if atheists who have been able to articulate any sense of meaning are borrowing from God.
Hmm.
Because, one, like you said, some of them were
Hmm.
raised in Christian homes. So an atheist can say that, well,
Yes.
I can do
Hmm.
good, I can be benevolent, I don't need
That's
God.
right.
But if you dig down,
Yeah.
what is the purpose? What is your motivation for doing good? If you don't need God, because
Hmm.
you in and of yourself, you are not good. Man is not good. We can be good and bad,
Hmm.
but what is my motivation for sending our tax
Right.
dollars to Ukraine to support people we don't know?
Hmm.
We're doing it because human
Hmm.
beings are created in the image of God. That's the motivation. But
Mm.
if I'm an atheist who doesn't believe in the existence of God and I'm sending tax dollars to
Hmm.
Ukraine, why am I doing it? Because I want to. I have no motivation. So you see,
Right.
I think that, well, you can articulate your atheistic views, but you must borrow from God. You are living in God's world. And so you didn't come into the universe with your own sense of right and wrong. You're borrowing.
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. There is like again, talking about the porous boundaries, right? So there are other practices that we would consider spiritual practices, such as meditation, right? That are used um, in a sort of secular setting, right? And sort of seen as devoid of religious content. So how many people practice forms of meditation, which came specifically out of sort of a very
Hmm.
spiritual grounding? Um, and so there is a lot of borrowing, right? A lot of seeing the places where there is good in certain religious beliefs and practices that then, of course, continue to drive a sense of ethics, right? A sense of moral responsibility to our fellow humankind.
Right. Okay. So I would like to ask this last question and then we'll sort of wrap up. Because we all have this innate, at least most of us have this innate proclivity, to seek the divine or be aware of what is around us. If we don't go to church or claim we're not religious, what new forms of religion, so-called religion, or groups or communities can we join to seek a sense of purpose and meaning? And what's going on out there beyond the church?
Yeah, there are back to humans being social creatures, finding meaning in our group, belonging. There are groups. You have, I think we see the rise of pagan religion, right? Sort of revival of pagan Wiccan religions in the United States, where there's these communities of belonging forming often around that. Um, in a certain sense, we all find group meaning and belonging in our lives. Now, whether that happens within a church community or outside of it is another matter, but we do seek out these belongings. And I think that's why I've pointed to a really healthy view of the church, and a healthy view of religion sees both the ways in which our spiritual lives are lived out in the world beyond the church, right? In our work, in our communities, our neighborhoods, but also sees the real power of belonging to a congregation, right? Of being rooted in a community of people who love you, who care for you, where you're seeking collectively, right? To show love to others, and to be a community in worship of God. So I think it requires us to understand and tell the story of the good that happens in our communal life as we gather together.
Dr. Norton, thank you so much for joining us on Unsettled. As I wrap up, I'll say a few words and then I'll let you come with your closing thoughts. All human beings all over the world have this innate proclivity, a desire. We have limitations. We are weak, though sometimes we're strong. That's a common experience to all human beings. We find ourselves alone in our rooms. We talk to ourselves as if there was someone there we're talking to. So there's something that transcends us, something that goes beyond us. You can deny it, you can suppress it, but it is there. It's part of our common human experience. And we're all seeking for the way, the truth, the ultimate reality. We may seek it in different ways because there could be different approaches people may want to look at. But basically, we have that sense of awareness in all of us. You may claim you're not religious, but that in and of itself is a type of religion. When we leave the church, we carve out another path. We look for another path. We join groups, tribes, online. Now, if you go to social media, Wiccan, they have a tribe. Um, all kinds of groups are online. People are following because they want purpose, meaning, community, sense of belongingness, and all of that. That's our human story. Dr. Norton, I'll let you have the last word. Any closing thought for us, believers, unbelievers, anybody watching?
Well, I'll just say, yeah. Well, thanks for this opportunity to chat, and I think for a closing word, I just hone in on what you're saying. We are all seeking, right? We're all seeking the way, and then this is a journey, And just to recognize that at times we will face doubts, we'll face questions, right? And I think that we shouldn't see that as a bad thing, but as part of the process. And to find, a trusted friend, leader, um, that you can walk alongside you, right, in this journey, who will engage you in the conversation and the questions along the way.
Thank you so much. Hopefully, we'll have you another time on Unsettled. Bye for now.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Unsettled podcast. Remember to subscribe and follow us on social media. This podcast is available on all platforms, on YouTube and on our website, liveunsettled.org. I am Martin Nyanzu. Until next time, God bless you.